This video is brought to you by Brilliant. In the last few years, we've seen the impact of high energy bills. It's pushed some working families into having to make a choice between eating and heating, whilst also contributing more widely to the cost of living crisis. In the run-up to the general election, the Labour Party outlined their plan for a new organisation known as GB Energy, which they promised would both help cut bills and accelerate the UK's transition to net zero. So in this video, we're going to explain this new GB Energy, what it's supposed to do, and whether it could actually succeed. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So the first thing to say is that GB Energy won't supply electricity to households, as is sometimes suggested. Instead, it plans to work with the private sector to invest in and manage renewable energy projects. Public investment in clean energy obviously isn't a new thing. The Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition actually created something similar, known as the Green Investment Bank. However, the key difference is that GB Energy is not expected simply to invest in renewable energy projects. It plans to coordinate and build them itself. Basically, GB Energy will not renationalise energy companies, but nor is it simply a government investment fund. It's something in the middle. As things stand, GB Energy is still in the process of being set up. Once the Great British Energy Bill passes through Parliament though, GB Energy will be given £8.3 billion in funding over the next 5 years, which it will use to invest in and manage clean energy projects. One of these projects has actually already been announced. Last week, Labour said they would lease land already owned by the royal family in order to build new wind farms on seabeds, something that, they hope, will help power 20 million homes. While this is a good start, it's worth mentioning that this isn't particularly novel. Previous governments have already used lots of land on the Crown estate. So much so, in fact, that a large proportion of the Crown's £1.1 billion of income came from offshore wind leasing. Anyway, Labour hope that every pound of public money that goes into GB Energy will attract between £3 to £7 of private investment via public-private partnerships. In other words, between £30 and £60 billion of private investment on top of the £8.3 billion pledged by the government. If this happens, Labour calculate that GB Energy could knock £300 off the average household energy bill, while simultaneously accelerating the shift to net zero and helping Labour meet its target of clean energy by 2030. However, as well as just accelerating investment into clean energy, there are at least two other rationales for GB Energy. First, as we mentioned a second ago, GB Energy isn't just going to chuck money at any old renewable project. Rather, it's going to coordinate them, strategically investing in projects that are best suited for the UK's energy infrastructure. One of the big problems with private investment in the energy sector at the moment is that the profit motive can sometimes run counter to the overall efficiency of the network. For instance, because the UK has one national price system for energy and energy producers don't have to take into account transmission costs, private investors have no incentive to build generating infrastructure near demand centres. This has meant that the infrastructure, such as the wires and cables needed to connect the supply to the demand, often hasn't been built fast enough. The result of this has been higher so-called constraint payments. Essentially, this is when the national grid pays generators to reduce their output, as the grid cannot cope with transferring high amounts of energy from one region to another. This is appalling value for money for the taxpayer. They pay lots of money to build out the cables, pylons and wires to reach all these generation projects, and then they have to pay even more when this infrastructure still can't cope with the load. The Labour government plan to address this is by offering financing via GB Energy for projects in more convenient locations, but also through the new plan to work with local communities to convince them to accept new energy projects nearer their population centres. This will reduce strain on the grid, as power won't need to be transferred from region to region as much, and it will enable local communities to benefit directly from energy that their area generates. Moreover, the government has claimed that any of the profits of these new local energy projects will go back into the local community, for example, to reduce energy costs. This sort of scheme actually already exists in some parts of the UK. Up in Scotland, the Finchley wind farm is owned by the community, and any excess profits go back into the community. Last year, these profits were reinvested into the community in the form of a £1,000 grant for households to install energy-efficient upgrades for their houses. Anyway, the second rationale for GB Energy is energy security. GB Energy aims to increase both the volume and reliability of the UK's domestic energy production, so the UK is less reliant on energy imports and therefore less vulnerable to global energy price shocks, akin to what happened in 2022. This was the same rationale the previous Conservative government appealed to when they granted hundreds of new licences for exploration of North Sea oil and gas, although Labour have said that they won't issue any more once they've come to power. While this argument does make some sense, it's worth mentioning that being energy secure or energy independent doesn't totally protect you from global fluctuations in energy prices. Even net energy exporters, like the US for instance, were affected by the energy price shock in 2022. So those are the reasons that Labour is so keen on GB Energy. Let's move on to the final part of this video. Will GB Energy actually succeed? In other words, will it accelerate the UK's transition to net zero while simultaneously lowering bills and improving energy security? Well, obviously, no one knows, but a lot here depends on whether or not it can mobilise private capital effectively. Without private capital, £8.3 billion over 5 years isn't going to make a dent in the UK's energy mix. After all, remember that Labour originally pledged £28 billion in green investment every year. But if GB Energy has to offer too much to convince private investors to get involved, it'll end up being bad value for money for the taxpayer, and full-on nationalisation might have just made more sense. On top of this, GB Energy will face a constant dilemma between investing its profits into more renewable projects, which is obviously the right thing to do in the long term, or giving money back to consumers through cheaper bills, which is the politically easier option. Ultimately, it'll be down to Starmer and his government to decide which they'd rather do. Be sure to keep an eye on this story as it evolves, as much like every area of our lives, this is likely to progress quickly. In fact, if you're feeling left behind by the news cycle and fast developments in AI and tech, you'll want to check out Brilliant. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. Learning a little every day is one of the most important things you can do, both for personal and professional growth. Brilliant helps you build real knowledge in minutes a day, with fun lessons you can do whenever you have time. It's the opposite of mindless scrolling and truly helps you to learn quickly, kind of like TLDR. One course I've found to be particularly interesting was their course on large language models. We hear a lot about AI and large language models in the news, but Brilliant helped me actually get hands-on with real language models as you explore how they build vocabulary, choose their next word, and more. They also helped me grasp the importance of training data by comparing models trained on Taylor Swift lyrics to models trained on a cookbook or big text terms and conditions. If you want to learn more and understand the world around you better, whether that's in order to get a job in AI or just to understand what everyone's talking about, you can try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. Visit brilliant.org/TLDR or click on the link in the description. Plus, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for watching and to Brilliant for sponsoring this video.